Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics. So, Remembrance Sunday, where we remember those who fell in wars started by someone else. Historically, war is man's greatest failure. They happen when at least one political leader decides that their greed is more important than sometimes millions of innocent lives. But there's arguably a greater failure now: climate abuse. War could conceivably end the human race, but it's probably unlikely to. Climate change, however, easily could end our species and certainly our civilization. And it's not even like we're acting out of ignorance. We know exactly what the problems are, we know exactly what's causing them, and we know exactly how to fix them. COP30 is underway in Brazil, the lungs of the world, and the United States is not playing its part. But there's still plenty for more engaged nations to achieve. But from our point of view in Europe, what is the UK and EU preparing to commit to? And what are they backing down from? Well, we'll have a look at some of these things over the course of the week as things are finalised. But what I really want to have a look at here is, what do we need to know about what our own governments are doing to help literally preserve the future of our species? Because I thought I would go over some of these key issues related to European efforts and then follow up with some more detailed agreements and commentary later this week. Because I don't think the reporting of COP is all that effective, in Britain at least. See, people often think that COP and climate action in general is about reducing carbon emissions, net zero and all that. And although that's arguably the single biggest issue to deal with, it is not the only one. So I've been given a handy little crib sheet by Bellwethers, the climate action group I talked about earlier this summer, ahead of the conference. Now let's begin with that and then look at what's already been said by the UK government. So one of the big showcase initiatives at COP30 is the TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. This is a fund designed to, as the name suggests, protect what's left of our rainforests, otherwise known as our oxygen supplies. Because the climate emergency is not isolated to the problems of carbon emissions, though they are incredibly important. But even if we manage to maintain temperatures to survivable levels for our species, we still need oxygen. So cutting down the forests which provide it is what we call in the industry a suboptimal strategy. Now, the UK has supported this initiative. However, I've also seen a report that we're maybe being a bit tight-fisted about it right now, which seems careless, as the fund is not charity as such, but generates financial returns. So although Keir Starmer is making a big show of UK support for the aims of COP by, first of all, attending in person, and he's already given quite a good speech, which I'll summarise in a moment, we're still being guilty of some short-sighted decisions, it seems. So what about the EU? Well, one of their major initiatives is the biodiversity strategy, which links the restoration of ecosystems with food security. Right now, in the UK and the EU and the USA and lots of other parts of the world, there's a cost of living crisis. We hear about it all the time because people are really feeling it. One of these specific forms people are really noticing is increases in the cost of food. Those dastardly eggs basically let Trump win the last presidential election. And it's not going away. In Britain, we compounded the problem with Brexit. But even the EU is seeing rising food prices. Why? Well, because climate change is delivering more bad harvests and permanently destroying more agricultural land every single year. It's really this simple. Climate change is reducing our available supply of food, so the cost of food goes up. This is a very specific problem which needs very focused solutions in order to prevent this continued loss of food production. Failing to do so will not just mean way more famines around the world, but even in the richer countries, rising food inflation, which we've already seen is a government killer all over the globe. Failing to manage the land will create two major sources of political instability. The first is that famine is likely to fuel increased numbers of refugees and wars. Well, asylum is now a very hot political potato all over the Western world. The second is increasing the cost of something none of us can do without: food. Allowing these issues to get out of hand will lead to political instability, which will also hamper our efforts to tackle other things like carbon emissions. These initiatives are absolutely vital. Without moves to protect rainforests, we're going to reduce the oxygen concentration in the very air we breathe. That is an existential threat to humanity. Without moves to protect agricultural land, we will create more refugees and see food prices rising uncomfortably high, driving political instability as well as famine. The very things that most concern people, even in rich countries in Europe, are very much tied to our resolve on tackling what are now existential climate issues. This should be what the media is alarming people about, not the colour of your neighbour's skin or what sort of temple they pray in, but our future supply of oxygen and food. They're way more important, but people don't appreciate the risk to them. But then there was Starmer's initial speech at COP30. Now, the tone of the speech I thought was very good. I read the transcript. I didn't listen to it. I read the transcript. It does exactly what I'd like to see more of. See, too much of the big arguments about the climate emergency are the suffering of people in faraway lands. Now, that's important, but it doesn't really cut through to a domestic public which is concerned about its own problems. And Starmer brought the issues down to our level. He began by pointing out that there used to be cross-party consensus on the climate emergency in Britain. The only arguments was how fast do we go? And now there isn't at all. In other words, making clear the threat to our climate action if we're not very careful about who forms the next government. But he then asked a series of questions like about energy security. Labour have made clear that solar and wind power is not just about cleaner energy, but more secure energy. Fossil fuel prices are only as stable as the countries who produce large quantities of them. Despite us not buying much Russian fuel, we bought like about 3%. The UK saw domestic energy bills literally double because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'll say it again to those listening too much to Nigel Farage. Never mind oil and gas in the North Sea. We don't own it. Some countries own their own natural sources of fossil fuels. We don't. We sold them all to multinational companies, and those companies sell it back to us for the same price as we'd pay for fuel from the Middle East or America. There's no mates race. We pay the full international price. That is why, although North Sea excavation wasn't hit by Russia's invasion, our energy bills still shot up. Fossil fuel prices are not secure. Second, Starmer referenced those who pay the energy bills. Cleaner energy is cheaper in the UK. The cost of producing electricity from wind and solar is way less than from fossil fuels here. And it's projected to become even cheaper as the technology for wind and solar generation is getting more advanced all the time. But the technology for producing energy from fossil fuels, that's done. He then explained another cost, flooding. Climate change means we suffer flooding more regularly and more severely. What does that cost our economy, as well as the individual people affected on a more personal level? He talked about rising food prices, increased migration flows, threats to national security, and which will all be important for Labour to communicate. It's not all doom if we make the wrong choice. We learned that lesson from the Brexit referendum, I hope, and last year's US presidential election when it comes to it. You cannot expect people to vote against just a worse scenario, especially if many think it's hypothetical. Well, we don't know Trump's a lunatic, right? You need the positive outlook to be the greater part of a campaign. Yes, you need to warn people about the risks of making the other decision, but people want to vote for a better life, not treading water in the shit. So he also talks about the economic benefits of taking action, the not far off 1 million jobs it will be creating by the end of this decade. In fact, listen to a direct quote. From revitalising our coastal communities to firing up our industrial heartlands. Those words were chosen with care. These are exactly the areas where Reform UK are currently doing well. By leaning into investment in green technologies, the government will not just boost our economy, make energy cheaper, address some of the pressing climate challenges, but the very areas which have been left behind and are now vulnerable to Reform UK will now be the big winners if they embrace it. Now, I'm sure some of you may have spotted the small flaw in this plan. It's all very well explaining this to delegates in Brazil, many of whom are already satisfied of the wisdom of these words and none of whom get to vote in the UK general election. But this message needs communicating to the British public regularly and loudly in the full knowledge that nobody is going to amplify it for them. Labour need to do this themselves, and right now they're not doing. But if they finally do realise that talking to the public might be a good idea for a government at some point, I would say the message itself is effective. It has a nice balance of the risks of not acting with the improvements to quality of life by acting. The message just needs to be repeated in this country. A lot. But let me know what you think in the comments below and please subscribe to the channel for more content. Thanks for listening and until next time, I'll see you later.